when you start to put a ceiling on an A player, they will immediately start to check out other jobs. You think they're checked out? They're not checked out. They're checking out other jobs. What an A player is looking for is a place to grow, right? A place to flourish and a place to shine and like be allowed to be an A players. Because A players know their value in some way, shape or form, right? They understand that like, dude, I get stuff done, and they're going to stand out in any field that they go to. It doesn't matter whether they know the profession or not, but as soon as you start crimping them, I think you're destined to be missing them very soon. What's up, and welcome back to the Get Out of Your Own Way show. Today, we're going to talk about why your team keeps leaving you. It's a big leadership problem. We've worked with a bunch of clients in the last just 3 months that have navigated their team leaving. And it's important that we help you wherever you are and whatever stage of your business, think about the problem differently. Now, I got to say for all the dads tuned in here, I'm multitask magician right now. My son is sleeping. He's in nap mode. So I'm going to be paying attention to him a little bit while we also go through this. And I just want to give kudos to all the dads out there that are also running business, because you got to be in multitask mode all the time. It's just a real thing. We got Marty in the house today.
Literally in the house.
Literally in the house. We got Marty is here again. The conversation about leadership is one he's very familiar with, has hired, had to let people go, and had various people leave, I'm sure, on their own accord throughout his professional career. And we're going to get some wisdom from him on this. What I'd like you to do, though, is buckle up and get ready. If you are watching us where you can see us, whether that's YouTube or any other live streaming channel, we're going to be doing some write-ups and modeling on the Vibe board today. If you are just listening, whether you're driving, running, lifting, if you're working in the office, it doesn't matter where you are. We want you to like really tune in and think critically about some of the suggestions we're making, and then make an action list of 1 to 2, maybe 3 items on leadership. Now, specifically, I want to give you an action step at the end of this podcast to help you organize your leadership better. If you've got people that are leaving, or you're starting to get that sense as a leader that something in the water is changing, because there is a feeling, Marty, I know you felt it, where you're just like, I think this person ain't happy.
I'm thinking to myself, the worst experience, and yet the best at the same time, is the person who you don't want to leave, and yet you know they have to leave because they want to advance their career. Often is usually the case, but
Yeah.
that is by far the hardest situation, because it's the person you don't want to lose. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They're your A players, right?
Correct. Yeah.
I think really, let's contextualize all this for anybody listening. This conversation is not for the turnover in your business for your like average standard employee. This is specifically about your A players. I want to keep that context in mind, because it's a very different game when you're talking about, if someone's like running your cashier, or, like the entry level positions.
Right. Correct.
Like, this is specifically a conversation. We'll talk about some data that's large and broad sweeping, but our conversation today is really about, like if people are leaving and they're A players, you really got to know how to handle that, because you're right. I think that it's very hard to lose A players. And I know this because I was also the A player that someone had to lose, right? And it made for difficult conversation on both sides. Like, we had to have some difficult conversations, but I think that there's lots of ways that business owners can take a better handle of their business and their team through this conversation.
You know this. I worked at Kmart after I finished college for a while, and I worked every department. I could go to any department, so I could fill in wherever someone wasn't there. I still remember when I was leaving there, it wasn't until I was leaving that they offered me a manager position. And I'm like, one, I wouldn't do it anyway, because that I knew that was not my life path. But why would you wait till someone's walking out the door, who obviously was an A player for them and could go anywhere for them, but you wait till that person's walking out the door before you do something about it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the problems, I've really got a list of just 3 that I see over and over that we can talk through, and then we can lean into your experience too. one of the experiences that I see and have been through on both sides as a leader and as the guy being sort of misled is do not give your A players a ceiling. If you give them a ceiling, they're probably going to bump into it sooner than you're ready for. And what happens, that doesn't mean don't put restrictions or like lanes and bumpers and boundaries. I'm not talking about that. But one of the problems I see happen with owners is they've got guys that are ambitious, that want to take it far. And they start to get a little scared about, does this person have too much influence? Or, is this person like in it for the long haul? And by restricting them really fast or taking away responsibilities or commission or what have you, you immediately send the red flag to the employee that like they're in danger.
When it's your own fear, right?
It's your own
that's
fear.
what it is.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. I had a boss that so before I was really building anything entrepreneurially, I had two significant bosses. One not a good leader, one a great leader, and I was handled essentially as an employee very differently in both cases. When I started to grow with the first boss, not a good leader, she took all of my responsibilities off the plate almost instantaneously. Like as soon as it was obvious that I was going to pass her or could pass her, it was like slip, and all of my it was so fast. It was so like frustrating to have these things that I was building and like creating that ultimately would have helped her make her job easier. But it was like, hey, I'm going to take that over. Hey, like, don't worry about that. I got this. And I was really young. I was probably like 23, 24. I was too young to really understand what was going on, but I knew what I felt, right? I was watching this stuff get all away.
I could see if you're building a castle and you were supposed to be building a mansion. All right, well then we have a problem. But the person that all their own insecurity comes up in that point because you're helping them advance.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that when you start to put a ceiling on an A player, they will immediately start to check out other jobs. Like you think they're checked out, they're not checked out. They're checking out other jobs. And what an A player is looking for is a place to grow, right? A place to flourish and a place to shine and like be allowed to be an A players. Because A players know their value in some way, shape, or form, right? They understand that like, dude, I get stuff done. And they're going to stand out in any field that they go to. It doesn't matter whether they know the profession or not. But as soon as you start crimping them and like selecting them away from things and trying to hide things, I think you're destined to be missing them very soon.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
What's your experience with that? Like, have you? It sounds like Kmart was one example, right? They like waited too long. They put a ceiling on you and waited too long.
Yeah.
But what's your experience in like the hiring sense or management sense?
I was not one to put a ceiling on people because now bear in mind, I am much more mission oriented. So I recognize that I'm a piece of a larger puzzle typically. And certainly in that world, that's the way it was. And I knew whoever that person was going to help build that mission out beyond me because I always try to be mindful that it was bigger than me in the first place. Everything I do was bigger than myself. And so I needed people that also thought like that and worked that way. It was more the people that put their own ceiling that became an obstacle, I think, to growing a business, much more than me putting a ceiling on them. Because I knew that's not helpful for anyone.
It's not. Yeah, I think a business owner's fear that typically drives that. I've seen it in a number of businesses that we've coached. Like, hey man, we've really got to get them to slow down. Like, no, your job is to stay ahead of them. Like, what do you need to do to constantly steer and guide? You got to be out in front.
And the more pieces of a puzzle you have, and in ministry, there were a lot of pieces that had to work together. You could not do it yourself. It's just the way it's designed. It is not designed for a person to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I think another key that business owners should really consider, especially kind of like new year energy that we're still in, is
new year, new you.
Oh, our least favorite saying. Go back a couple podcasts if you haven't heard us absolutely trash that statement. But one of those things that I see in this like kind of new year space is that the assumption that a business owner makes is that an A player is happy. You assume they're happy, you assume they're content, and you assume that with, maybe good benefits, good provision, good salary, all those things, they're like, that's enough for them. And the reason I think this is important for people to really pay attention to is that A players are generally not going to get a lot of grease. They're not the squeaky wheel. They're the type that you can leave alone and they'll get a lot of shit done for you. They'll move mountains and they can. But if you just assume like, oh, well, they're getting paid great. We're paying them 6, 12, 18% commission or whatever. You assume that like, hey, they're happy here. What you might be missing is that they want a mission. They want personal growth, that they want to explore, I don't know, running like becoming a manager of people, or that their long-term career objectives get kind of misaligned with where you want to go. And it's really important to do an emotional check-in and a check-in on a regular basis with A players.
Yeah, so no one would be surprised by this. Number one reason people leave is low pay. That's often just the case.
Makes
But
sense.
speak along those lines, what you're saying, the number 2 and 3 reasons. One, no advancement opportunity.
Yep.
Where do I go? And the third one is feel disrespected and lack of recognition.
Yep. It's A and B right there.
Yeah. Like take pay off because everyone knows that anyway. That's often the reason. But they're essentially the first two after that.
When 2020 was going on, there was a lot of data coming out around pay though that was very interesting. And like I understand why that's true, right? If there's a mega disparity, your people are going to leave. Like that's just real. But for an A player, I do think, and the data supported it then, I'm sure it does now. I didn't look into this particular set of data, but there was a lot of data in 2020 that suggests that people were leaving for less pay for a better alignment.
Yes.
And, I think the reason that data is so significant is that for the majority of jobs, $1, $3, $10,000, whatever it is, however it's measured, hourly, yearly salary, et cetera, right? If you've got a family, if you've got people that you got to take care of, like that number is significant. But at the higher levels where A players tend to float, I do think that 10, 20 grand sometimes isn't enough to sway someone to leave a really good growing position where they can advance, they can evolve, they can develop new skills, and they feel aligned to a mission. But if you don't ask them what they want, or if you don't ask your team what they want, if you don't meet one-on-one with them and kind of check in, I think it is your fault. That's what I'm not going to beat around the bush. I think it's your fault. Like you done messed up, Aaron, right? It's my job to be like, hey, is everybody here feeling aligned with where we're going? And if you're not, let's talk about it. Like it doesn't mean that something's wrong, but if you're feeling good about all the other things and you're not feeling good about, hey, I feel like I don't feel like I'm growing, it's worth it to an employer to say, let's send you to a conference. What would you like to learn? Let's get some training for you. Let's invest in your professional or personal development. Like it makes sense to do that. But I think that often, because a CEO is likely to be managing a lot of people, depending on the size of the org and how many ladders are in between, I do think a CEO is likely to pay attention to the problems, not the people that are absolutely crushing it, aside from like a little accolade here and there.
Correct. Yeah. Because it's easy to focus on the problems, typically.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because why would you focus on the car that's running perfectly? You worry about the one that's breaking down and so on and so on. It's easy to forget that there are people. I always try to keep in mind that it requires everyone in the organization to make all of the whole thing successful, not just one person.
Yeah, definitely. The third key that I think is worth a business owner really reflecting on is, are you mindful that your A player has options? And that doesn't mean you got to tiptoe on eggshells, but you got to understand that like they got options. And
options in that they could go elsewhere. Is that what you mean?
They can go elsewhere. Yeah. So if they're a good salesperson, let's say, it doesn't matter what they're selling. If you can sell water, you can sell houses. You can sell houses, you can sell boats. You can sell boats, you can sell airplanes. Like, you kind of learn the method. And if you feel aligned with the product, you typically tend to do well. That's in a sales role, as an example. But not having a ceiling and then making sure you're really checking in on like, hey, are they aligned, or are you giving them enough to really feel substantiated in the business? And I think the third thing is like, hey, I just think there's a lot of unfortunate leadership where people are not asking the questions of like, hey, I recognize that you could work anywhere else. And how can I lead you better? And what I think really this comes to, let me reframe it, because I guess the way that I phrase that makes it sound like a them thing. As a business owner, you got to recognize they have options and they need vision. So they have options and they need vision, which essentially means you've got to show them where they can go. You've got to lead them to a place where they can get there. They can organize it, develop it, create it. But like, they've got to have space inside your vision. Your vision has to be big enough for them to have their own vision inside of it. And that requires you to recognize that they can go somewhere else unless you give them space and you give them a lot of room to like design and architect and plant ideas and sort of become who they want to be, not who you think they could be.
Yeah, what came to mind is that you as a leader have an opportunity to get out ahead of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that that person's even thinking about leaving. However, they can leave whenever they want, technically, right? They don't have to stay. But if you get out ahead of it and actually put on the table what the possibility is, that you know that this is entirely possible, it takes the edge off of that even being an option sometimes for people.
For sure. Like, though this is strange, like any romantic relationship, right? You tend to operate best when both parties know like, hey, we're better together than we are apart.
Right.
But not by force, right? I'm not like forcing you, like I'm not golden handcuffing you. Though that is a method that many leaders use.
If you're locked up in the basement, you got a problem.
Yeah. But I do think there's a reflection needed by business owners who they're not strategically thinking through like, hey, this person could work anywhere. So how do I build a vision that allows them to sort of chart their own course inside of it? And you've got to paint a pretty big vision if you got 8 players. Like otherwise they're going to go somewhere that does.
I'm just, the thought that came to mind when you were saying that was, you also better be able to admit that you're not the smartest person in the room.
I love that, man. That should be key number 4. It's okay not to have the answers.
That is almost always, not always, but it's often the problem, because you think you know better than everyone else in the room. And that just isn't always true.
Yeah. Then you're in boss mode, not leader mode.
Correct.
What I'm reminded of is so I had this really hard boss that just really sapped the life out of me. I ended up leaving to go to a better place. Took a huge pay cut, like $20,000 pay cut when I made 60 a year. Like that's a big cut, right? It was so bad that I was willing to take a third of my paycheck when I was 25 years old and be like, I'm out. And when I got to a place, the guy that hired me, his name was Frank, and then his boss's name was Frank. I ended up meeting with both of them, and I asked them like, what do you want? Like, what do you see? I didn't know the word vision, and I was young. I didn't know what the heck I was doing really. But both of them were like, well, we're trying to design a system that can run on, that we have all this software, but it doesn't really work well together. So my job was what I pitched was, hey, I'll build you something that can last 10 years. How about that? And as soon as I pitched that, I could see it in their eyes. Like they didn't know if they wanted to trust me, right? It was a little bit of hesitation.
Well, but you probably didn't know what you were doing anyway.
I mean, I had to figure it out, but I was like, hey, like if that's what you want, I'll figure it out for you. But once I started going down that track, I think they also recognized that they couldn't dictate that for me. They needed to let me do it. And by saying like, hey, we want this thing, this 10-year map or system or structure, they got to tell me a vision, and then they got out of the way, right? And oftentimes I just see like these owners that think they have all the answers, and like, then why would you hire somebody if you want an A player? Don't pretend like you have the answer. I think one of the best things leaders can do is look around and be like, who can I hire that's smarter than me? Who can I hire that understands this better than me? And then obviously you got to listen, right? You got to like really reframe your ego here. But if you can cast a vision, you're in good shape.
It's really hard to work with a micromanager, in my experience. Very hard.
Yes. Oh, it's the worst. Yeah.
And
I don't know any.
The person who thinks they know it all typically is the micromanager.
Yeah. Yeah. They're in the weeds too much. Yeah. I'd say if you're doing those four things, right? If you are mindful that there's not a ceiling, if you're actively asking someone like how they want to grow, if you are attentive to there's more to this than just pay and like the niceties and the perks of the job, if you're asking them how they want to explore and how they can expand and making sure that their growth is aligned with yours, you're casting a big vision, and you're willing to set your ego at the door, you're likely to keep good talent. That doesn't mean you always are, right? That doesn't mean that you get to dictate and control their lives, but those behaviors are certainly likely to start pushing people out the door. Or you're going to run in like 3-year cycles, 2-year cycles where it's like you get somebody good for 2 years and they're like, you know what?
Which is exhausting. Yeah.
Because I think an A player also has like a resilience to be like, okay, I'm gonna keep fighting through this, and maybe it'll get better. But I do think there's an opportunity for leaders to really reflect on like, hey, am I doing that? Am I showing up to meetings this way? Am I having one-on-one conversations? Am I checking in? Am I like, is this structured into my job?
I think it's also important to, when you have A players, that they're in the right seat. Because I've had this this has probably been the most consistent thing I have found is I often inherited a team. Here's your people, figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And there were eight. I mean, I could figure out fairly quickly who would stay, who would leave. But the A players oftentimes were just in the wrong seat. And can you move them to a seat that's better suited for their skills and what they bring to the table?
Yeah,
I have found that's because we often hire to fill a hole rather than who's this person that we're bringing in and how do they contribute to the organization. And at some point we have to move beyond hiring to fill holes. The whole hiring process, I think, is screwy when it comes to that.
Yeah,
because it doesn't look at the person.
Yeah, you're not looking at culture. You're not looking at values. You're just looking at like proficiency.
I will tell you, Aaron, the one thing I read today was that we all have seen job descriptions. We've tried to is this job description a good fit? And they haven't changed at all. Like, the job descriptions are still written the same way. Well, I learned today they're written the way they're written because that's all newspapers would allow at that time, and we have not changed. Yeah, we have not changed the model at all.
Oh my God. How old was that? Like 100 years?
Yeah.
Holy shit. So we write job descriptions based on something that was done 100 years ago.
Who even reads newspapers for that?
That's incredible. I had no idea. That's why we wrote job descriptions like that.
That was Harvard Business Review. That's where I read that. They just did a study on hiring
practices. That's an insane practice. That doesn't make any sense. Why the heck why would we do that? We don't do anything the same that we did 100 years ago.
Even if you go on LinkedIn, a lot of them are written the same way.
Yeah. Dude, that's a absolutely bogus idea that because we wrote job descriptions 100 years ago in newspapers a certain way, we're just going to keep doing it the same way, even though on LinkedIn and other places, you got lots of options for ways to write it. We're just going to keep doing this. What kind of idiotic thinking is that?
Because newspapers, you had to pay by the line.
Wow. Well, I think another interesting part of this conversation for leaders, like if you lose an A player, Marty, to me, it's a really good opportunity to reflect on which side of the fence are you on? Like, is it a me thing? Is it a them thing? And it can be a mix of both. So I'm not saying that it can't, but I think leaders often just dismiss it. Like it could be something they're missing or something they're not doing. And they're just like, well, he wanted something different or she wanted to go somewhere else or and I think that it's actually a really important time for leaders to slow down and think about like, okay, maybe you can get that in an exit interview, but can you actually do a bit of deep reflection on what went wrong?
Yeah. So, when I was reading that study by Harvard Business Review, they never interviewed someone when they left their job because they knew that they wouldn't be honest. So they waited until they got a new job and then interviewed them about their experience of leaving that job to really get to the heart of like what was going on in that situation.
Interesting.
And a lot of times it was the culture of the organization.
So I read a stat that 50% of people in 2024 were looking for new jobs, which means that half of your team, at least, because data is at least, right? There's probably a lot of people who wouldn't admit to that, are looking around. And if you're seeing a cycle, maybe you're too far in the weeds as a leader where you're not reviewing like how long is it? What's the average data cycle of, a staff member, an A player, somebody in the sales role or in the COO role or what have you. I think it's a really good thing to look at though. Remember Miss Bad Boss? While I was there like 3 years. So I went from maintenance technician to assistant manager. And in the course of like that maybe 3.5 years, not an incredibly long time. I think I was 25 when I left and went to a new spot. In that 3.5 year time, we went through like 16 people. And we knew it. We knew it as a staff. Like we were like, no one wants to work here. It was so odd. Like we joked about it. Like no one wants to work for this woman.
But she was never the problem, right?
Never. And one of the things that we thought about was like, how has no one up above her? This is a relatively large and structured organization, huge company, had properties all over the fucking US. So we're like, how has no one looked at her turnover, right? How has no one reviewed this? And now doing a lot of work with small to mid-sized companies, I think the same thing has to happen there. How has no one reviewed turnover? If you're losing a C-suite person every 2 years, the problem is not the C-suite person. Like the problem is you, right? The problem is the CEO or the owner or however you've structured it. If you're the one making the call and they're leaving every 2 years.
It still comes back to you. Yeah.
So I think that lesson taught me a lot because I watched people in and out. They'd stay for a year and be like, dude, I'm out. Some people didn't even last 3 months. Like not even because they didn't do the work. They were just like, dude, this is nuts.
Yeah,
like, I'm getting spun around left and right. I don't want this.
Yeah.
And it really created a chance for me to look at, what do I want to be like as a leader? How do I want to lead? And what comes to mind is that if you have, I'm getting to the board for those of you that are on audio. If you have a big vision, if you are like really compelling with what you want to build, you will end up with a team commensurate to the level of that vision. I'll give you an example of this. 10 years ago, Marty, this is a pop quiz for you. 10 years ago, if you were a top aerospace engineer, what company did you want to work for?
NASA.
NASA, hands down. We were like, dude, absolutely want to work for NASA. Where's the top aerospace engineering talent want to work now?
Don't ask me because I don't know that, but it would be Elon Musk's company most likely.
It'd be Musk. Yeah, it'd be SpaceX.
SpaceX.
And so if you think about what changed, NASA didn't change. part of the problem. But the options for strong team talent went to vision. They just moved over to vision. If the vision is big, you'll get a stellar team. I think a big vision will attract a stellar team for the key insights that you and I have talked about, right? When you have a stellar team, though, you got to be really good at getting out of the way. To say it better, as a leader with a big vision, you got to get out of your own way. Oh, look at what we did there. But once you have a big vision and you have a stellar team in place, then the next thing is, the action that you take. And I think the goal is to create aligned action that takes you to vision. And last but not least, like all three of these things, and this is what I want to talk to you about a little bit, Marty, is we have strategic risk. Why do leaders hesitate to invest in A players?
I'm going to have to ask you to tell me why.
Well, I'm curious about your perspective here. Like, my take is that leaders.
I was just thinking. I had a different idea when it came to strategic risk. I
think there's a resource risk when it comes to A players, right? You've got to risk your resources to bring in top talent. But yeah, there's a lot more to risk than just your team, for sure. You've got to risk old ways. You've got to risk old methodologies. You've got to do the Microsoft shift and go from selling CDs of your program to now building subscription services. Like, there's a lot of that. But I think a big part of strategic risk is talent.
The risk is when you help them grow, they'll leave.
That's always
the biggest risk.
Definitely. And what's interesting is if you don't invest in them, you guarantee they'll leave.
Right.
It's guaranteed. Like, as a guy, so I remember asking for essentially investment, right? I wanted to go to conferences and all these things. And Bad Boss did it sort of reluctantly, but I had to pump in. It really wasn't through her. It was through like the major company, but that felt like something I was getting, right? But at a certain point, that became like the minimum because I was already having all my responsibilities taken away from anyway. I think if leaders are wise with their dollars, they put them back into A players because A players multiply money. And B/C players, less so, right? But A players multiply money. It's an ROI machine to put money into an A player. Like, I don't know any stats specifically of my history, but I was more productive than like multiple members of the team combined at every job that I had, right? You could take my production and compare it to number 2, 3, and 4, and I was more productive than 2, 3, and 4 in the same amount of time combined, right? And I think that some of that's like workload, but I also think some of that is just how A players are wired. So why would you not risk more to like feed that, right? Why do you think leaders get hung up on that?
I think just what I said, that this person's going to leave and go elsewhere. I don't think there's logic to that rationale.
But is it like budget? Is it trying to find resources? Is it saying no? Is it trying to create equality? Like, where do you think people get hung up?
Budget is too easy of an answer. I think that's a quick cop out. I personally, you can make it happen somehow. So I think that's an easy answer if you don't want to be honest with the person. But I think it was early on you asked this in this conversation about are the people around you happy? Are they enjoying what they're doing? I forget how you phrased it. I think the leader often doesn't want to know how that person is actually feeling about what they're doing, because there's a risk in that, in even asking the question. And the leader often doesn't want to know what is actually because if I came to you and said I want to do this for growth, the thinking of a leader can be, oh no, what's wrong? What's the problem? Again, you've talked about this already as well. They're only focused on problems most of the time. And so they see it as a problem. rather than the investment that it could be. So
Right.
I think it has way more to do with the leader's mindset than anything.
Interesting. So here's how I would articulate what you just said, that more leaders are focused on problems than they are on vision.
And the person is, it just becomes a problem.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of the walk on eggshells like relationship, right? Where you can't say like, "Hey, we can make this better," or "I'd like to get better," without someone being like, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute,"
Yeah,
or vice versa, not doing a check in because I might discover there's a problem and then have to deal with it.
correct. Yeah, so you just avoid it altogether. That's why the budget thing is an easy cop out.
Yeah, yeah, it's good advice. What do you think is driving people to look for jobs?
I think we live in a very different age where people are much more aware of what goes on in a company than ever before. I can Google any company I want and find out what it is like to work and operate in that company. And if if the company is still writing their job description based on 100 years ago, what's that company like? So I think there's a level of consciousness that leaders leaders are often the last ones to figure out what to do with what's going on, in my experience, because it doesn't impact them directly often at first. But there's a different level of consciousness that exists, especially your generation and younger, that did not exist before. And until companies learn how to maneuver that and handle that, they're going to continue to have issues with workforce, I think.
Yeah, yeah. To me, there's a lot of wisdom, I think, in that statement, that leaders hear last what's really going on. I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. Specifically because we work with guys that are like small to mid-sized business. What I also think is a symptom, uh, aside from like A players leaving, is A players getting silent. Uh, it Because what that is essentially means is that you are not listening to your A players anymore.
Correct.
So I think in a lot of ways, dude, you hit the nail like directly on the head with the hammer. The Like, what's been your experience with trying to like rescue somebody before they leaves? Good idea, bad idea? What do you think?
Oh, like me trying to rescue them?
Like an A player might be like, "Hey, I'm not happy here. I'm gonna look elsewhere." Like, what do you think? Do I try to rescue them? Do I not?
I can think of really on one hand the people that I worked with where I knew if they left, I don't know what I how I would fill that role. But I think it is, you run the risk of resentment if you try to fight to hold that person,
Hmm. Resentment of you to them to you.
of them to you.
Hmm.
Again, mindful that money is not always the reason why they want to leave.
Yeah,
Even if they say it's money, it
right.
isn't always money.
It isn't always money.
And
Yeah,
unless you're willing to really figure out, help understand why they're doing it. Now, it's different if that person has already found a job and they're leaving, whether you want them to or not.
yeah,
The person who's kind of in that process that may approach you about it may still want to try to work it out.
yeah, yeah. To me, okay. Here's my take. One conversation and one conversation only is the max that a leader should have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like, don't, if that conversation isn't about figuring it out, if they're already like, I think I need to look for something else, or I'm committed to that, or I've already chosen, then that's your one conversation. And if that conversation is directly about like, hey, I want to stay, but I want to have a couple conversations about it, then you got one conversation to figure it out. But let's
Correct.
not make this a 6-month debacle and like in and out kind of bullshit.
Oh, absolutely not. But I would clarify that a little bit. That one conversation has to be about that person, not you.
Nice.
It has to.
Nice.
If it's
Yeah.
about you, they're walking out the door.
Yep. Yeah, which requires you to be the leader that they are clearly unsatisfied with in the first place.
Correct. You better be willing to shut up and listen.
Yeah, and that's the hard line is like if you're getting to that place and you can't listen, then they are accurate in their assessment of your leadership and they're accurate in their departing.
Correct.
I wouldn't want to stay there. Heck no. If you can't
Nope.
listen to like what I need in the first place. Now, I do think there's the A player conversation that's like, hey, I'm being offered something over here. Hey,
Right.
I'm being headhunted and like there's options for me. I like it here. How do you respond as a leader when an A player steps up? Like, because you can make that shit up nowadays. What's real, what's not real.
That is a very fine line because it is also easy to manipulate to get what you want.
Yes. Yeah, that's where I think the leader has to be very mindful of like, what's the game here? Because an A player, right? It's possible and likely. I mean, I had opportunities like this where, hey, I can go over here and make an extra 20 grand. I don't really want to go over there, but maybe this is a great time for me to go make 20 more grand and say, hey, there's a $20,000 offer over here. Now, the risk to the A player is like, if I go into my boss's office and I'm like, hey, I can leave and make 20 extra grand, even though I don't want to, it's really a manipulation play on, can I get 20 more grand out of you? And if you tell me no, I'm out. Like, I have to leave, right? Like, if you tell me no, I got to go.
You cannot negotiate with a terrorist. That's like the number one rule in foreign policy. You cannot negotiate with a terrorist. And essentially that's what that person puts themselves as when they come in there in that way. They are a terrorist. And you as a leader better be willing to, again, shut up and listen, because you'll figure out, you could discern what's really going on there.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And you have to trust like if your gut's like being torn apart in that situation, let them walk.
Nice. Yeah, it's an interesting turn to sort of spin it back to the A player and reflecting on, what's going on with them. But I've watched that happen a couple times and have as a coach had to sit in on conversations where I'm like, hey, that what is happening right now is more or less blackmail. You either pay me more or I leave. Like, well, wait a minute. Like, this doesn't work like that. That's not, I'm here to, and look, for the good leaders that are listening to this call, who really do care about their team and do check-ins and make sure the ceiling is off, like, that's the red flag to say like, hey, I'm out of this. I don't want to do this anymore. Because you're in charge.
I'm getting fired up because I had someone early on as an administrator, and I finally, I won't even identify their gender. I told I'm like, get out now. And that was the end of it.
What did they try to argue?
It was all manipulative. They were very manipulative.
Yeah. It's hard to sniff that out when you don't have a lot of experience, though. For a new time entrepreneur, for a new time leader, like, how do you know it's manipulation versus authentic? Because this can be an authentic situation. It does happen.
Yes, that is true. Know thyself. It's interesting because in the Harvard Business Review, the ones that go on that typically succeed the most have found a coach or a mentor that can help them. And I think it works the same way. If you're a leader, you got to know thyself. You got to be able to listen to what's going on inside of you in the middle of that situation and trust what's happening of what's going on. That's why I said, if your gut's being torn apart, let them walk.
Yeah, let them go. Yeah. It's an interesting ulterior perspective of where we started, which is like, hey, A players are leaving. But I do think it's important to contextualize that because, if you have a trend where people are leaving consistently and over and over and over, they're constantly like abandoning the business, it is worth looking at.
Correct.
I think this situation is sort of a small one-time, this shouldn't be happening often. If it's happening often, you got different problems. Maybe too juvenile with your experience and need to kind of level up. But I do think that the conversation about leadership with A players is an important one, because for everyone else in the business, B, C, D, E, whatever you want to call it, or, your entry level positions, these rules are very different. But A players need almost like a governing system that's incredibly unique, because they can go anywhere. And if you want to keep them, it's culture, it's commitment, it's vision, and in some ways, I think it's values. Though I would differentiate that from culture by meaning personal values, like you as a leader and them aligning on values. Culture is like the business values, the systems and standards there. But you've got to have those things dialed in. If you don't have those things dialed in, I think you are in a world of hurt when you get an A player and then lose an A player, because that's way worse than never having one in many ways.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking to myself, I mean, I was fortunate because I did have people who, and obviously it says something about me, and I'm aware of that were willing to come to me and tell me that they weren't happy, and to be able to figure out what that was before they ever left. And oftentimes it was because they were in a role that just wasn't suited for them.
Not the right fit. Yeah.
Yeah. And not wanting to lose the person, where are they a better fit in that situation? So I am grateful that people would at least come to me and tell me that they weren't happy with what they were doing. And then I could work. It's way easier to work with that before it explodes.
Yeah. Well, like we started with, the reason your team keeps quitting, the reason your best members keep walking away, the reason your A players keep jettisoning out is you. And if you take a moment and just really own that, you actually have upside potential to change. You might need a coach. We've got a great program here for you. You might need to go get some education, like some structured education. You might need to really, really think about what it means to be a leader, work on your emotional intelligence, work on your communication. There might be a road that you've got to go down that's a long, arduous road. But if you are hemorrhaging good people, if you are hemorrhaging talent, it's time to look in the mirror. And I don't think we have that conversation enough. We're here to have a front-facing conversation on it. And I'm going to give you one homework assignment that you can do today, right now, while you're in the car, you're driving. It won't take you very long. But I want you to reach out to one of your employees and say, hey, can I take you to lunch and ask you how I'm doing as a leader? Their response is going to tell you everything you need to know about where you stand. Because if they're enthusiastic about it, you're doing something right. You're going to get a green flag, and they're going to be thrilled about it. And if there's like, I got a lot going on, or you sense some sort of hesitation to do it, or they give you a flat answer, you can bet your marbles and your ROI this next month, whatever that is, whatever your profit is in February, you can bet it that you are not a leader to them, you're a boss to them.
They don't want to spend time with you. That's what I'm saying.
They don't want to talk to you. They don't want to open up to you. They don't feel safe around you. And that, in my opinion, the word that I would use is that you're not leading them, you're in charge of them. And there's a tremendous difference. There's some great resources out there on this, tons of books on leadership. I'm not talking like John Maxwell books, but also you can go Simon Sinek, you can go a bunch of books. But I would encourage you to think about communication in this. I would encourage you to think about listening in this, and social emotional intelligence before you go down any other like leadership tracks. Like those three things need to be really, really powerful. But ask your question. Find an employee that's been with you for a sustainable amount of time, not just like new, but 6 months, a year, 2 years, and ask them. And like, you're going to learn a lot. Oh boy, you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah, I cannot stress enough how much listening and showing that you care about that person, not as a problem, but as a person, you will get so much more out of that person if you listen and you care for them. That's it.
Yep.
I don't care if they're A player or a D player.
Yep. My boss, Frank, the good boss, in the story of my employment career, he said to me one time, he's like, Aaron, I know you're going to leave. I know you're going to leave. Now, that is not always the case for especially entrepreneurs, right? You can have a teammate roll with you for a long time as an entrepreneur. But in this particular business, I'm like managing an apartment complex. I'm sure he was pretty clear that I wasn't my passion for the rest of my life. So he said, I know you're going to leave. All I'm asking is that you talk to me the whole way through and let me know what's going on so that I can defend you. I can take care of you and I can like help you because I know you're going to be successful at whatever you do. And that kind of statement for me set me free because I was building a business while I was also, so at that time I was working for him. I was building a nonprofit that later became a venture-backed company. And I was moonlighting as a soccer coach with like 3 or 4 different teams in a high school program. I was working all the time. And he knew that I was doing like managing some of this stuff while I was in the office. Like, but if I tried to hide it, it would have been way worse. And I think that conversation opened up this door for just an honest conversation about his level of care, my level of commitment, and we could ride together. I ended up giving him 6 months notice. And that's a long time. Like most employers would be like, dude, I'm cutting you off here. Like I'm not dealing with this for 6 months. But whether or not your team decides to leave, whether or not your team decides to exit, I think having an honest relationship like that actually gives you the kind of performance that A players can bring. An A player's like 80% is better than most people's 100%. But if you can tap into like, hey, I care about you. I want you to be happy here. I want you to be fulfilled. How can I add to your life, not just your profession? I think to your point, Marty, you're going to get so much out of that person professionally and personally.
Even if it wasn't an A player, if someone told me that they were thinking about leaving or looking for something else, I always wanted to help them find what was best for them. I don't care who you are. If you're throwing stakes at me on your way out, you're on your own at that point.
Yeah.
But most people are open to you helping them in that process of finding what's best for them. That was always what's best for you? What's the best seat for you?
Well, and here's maybe a concluding point. If you go in with that mindset, that's where you can make a decision about do they stay in the organization or do they not. But if you don't even ask that question, you can't make an adjustment internally anyway.
Correct. Yeah, when you had put on the board there about risk, is it strategic risk? Well, I'll tell you the thought that came to mind was about you need to know all the pieces in the puzzle before you start trying to move pieces and putting pieces in different places. And this person, you need to understand what's going on and who's who and what's what before you start just moving things around.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're tuned in, do your homework. Text one of your longer term employees that you want to sit down and learn about what they love, what's going well, how you can improve as a leader. Take them to lunch, ask them to lunch and see what your response is. You will learn a lot about where you're at as a leader. And if it is not a positive set of feedback that you get, call us or call someone that can begin to help you organize as a better leader. I think that it's important you look at your turnover rates. It's important you review the last couple of years. It depends on how long you've run your business, but if you're a decade in, look at how many people have come and gone in that time span and really start to do some self-reflection.
Especially, I would add, especially since COVID, because it's been such a turbulent work time.
Yep.
Like, look in that time frame, what your retention rate has been.
It's a great call, man. Yeah, 2020 to 2025. If you need help with the vision that helps you attract the team, that's what our program does. That's what we're here to help leaders do. We work with the number 1, number 2, and all the way down through the C-suite management floor. We might be able to help you get a bigger vision so that you are not constantly stepping on your team and squandering their talent. But also, we're going to help you transform into a leader. So if that's something that you want to learn more about, it is for the select few who are truly ready to transform into a viable, I'd say, attractive leader. Like magnetic is probably a better word. It's not attractive. Like let's use magnetic. Like if you're ready to become a magnetic leader, vision is the answer. So we can help you with that. Have a good rest of your day today. Drive safe.
Hold on, I have one other thought.
What you got?
I know I made the right move with Kmart because they're now out of business, and I'm still here.
Mic drop. Kmart, you're out.
Right.
I think you made a right move not to go to Kmart for a lot of reasons
Right.
other than they're not in business. But I mean, we can go with that one, we definitely can.
That seems like 15 lifetimes ago.
I know, man. I know. So does working, maintenance or some of these jobs. It's pretty crazy. Okay. You got homework to do, Mr. or Miss or Mrs. CEO.
Ms.
Get to work, see where your team is at. And if it's hard numbers and hard realization while you look in the mirror, know that we got you. We felt a lot of leaders transform and we're happy to help you. Okay. Stay out of your own way and we will see you on the next episode. Follow us online, comment on Instagram. Let us know how you like this episode. We'll bring more your way.